I've been asked, to address on the topic the need to adopt adequate measures to prevent mass atrocities and crimes against humanity in Zimbabwe. This is, obviously a very sensitive topic, which ought to be, addressed objectively and with a lot of sensitivity. The main, reason being, the complex history of the continent of Africa, but also the complex history of, the nation of Zimbabwe, whereby, the conflicts or the political strife, if I were to use a lesser term, is multi-dimensional and has got multiple, stakeholders. So all those, dynamics have to be, taken into account in addressing, the issue of Zimbabwe. But particularly, we have a situation in Zimbabwe where, the former victims of, the war of, liberation were not adequately rehabilitated because, the war took place at a time when, psychosocial interventions were not, very, very popular then. So we have victims, some of whom ended up also becoming perpetrators. And we have got former perpetrators, like, the white nationalists in the country, who are now also, victims. So it's a very complex dynamic, and particularly where we are talking about, the death of people in thousands or hundreds is not a topic that should be approached through an academic exegesis, but with a lot of sensitivity, which is what I'm going to do today. Let me speak a little bit about, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a small country that is, close to South Africa, in Southern Africa. It's more, and our neighbors are Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia, South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia. It is a very beautiful country, one of the top producers of diamond, platinum, and iron ore in the world. It has got very beautiful people, beauty of the heart, very peace-loving people. But why have I introduced, Zimbabwe by, talking about its positive attributes? I've met a lot of, Rwandese, people, a lot of Kenyan people in the UK, where I'm currently living. Very lovely people, very peace-loving people. People from the Sudan, very lovely people. But whoever thought that such, lovely people, beautiful people would, people from beautiful countries like Rwanda would end up, committing genocide, one against each other. Whoever thought that lovely people, from the nation of Kenya would end up carrying swords, to decapitate each other. Why I'm bringing, this particular point is that genocide, I think each and every one of us has maybe the potential to be ugly, to be nasty, and even to kill. That's what I think. So sometimes when you're talking of, people who perpetrate, genocide, we think of maybe an ugly individual and all that. But I actually think, genocide and mass atrocities are committed by people like you and me. People were raised up to be good boys and girls, and the parents never thought that one day the narrative, they had about their child would change for the worse. Let's talk about the Boston bomb, for example. The mother in Russia was, talking about a lovely boy, seeing the pictures of an all smiley boy. But whoever thought that such a lovely boy would end up, doing what he did? So we want to talk about, mass atrocities and put them into perspective. Because when people are talking about maybe President Mugabe, maybe they think of a maybe ugly-hearted, person who is unapproachable. But I think if you were to read, the book Dinner with Mugabe, for example, you would also see the humanity that is actually a Catholic who strongly believes in God. But some things have happened under his governance. So sometimes we need to detach, I think, the evil that the person has done from the person himself or herself. That is very important on many levels, but particularly that if you want to change a situation in a country, you are talking of human beings that needs to be rehabilitated, that needs to be understood. But once you have put a person in a pigeonhole, judge them, and you make it very difficult to engage that particular individual, it becomes very difficult to attain sustainable peace and security. Coming back to Zimbabwe, for the past 50 years, Zimbabwe has been a theater of conflict. In the 1970s, the country, which was known as Rhodesia then, under successive governments, but mainly the notorious government of Ian Smith, who was a British white nationalist, fought a war against the black nationalists who were claiming independence, and about 50,000 people died in that war. And my chief here, Edson Chiota, also fought, was part of the black nationalists fighting to dethrone Ian Smith's government. And atrocities were commonplace, crimes against humanity were widespread, torture was committed by both sides. Ian Smith, his government did not respect the rule of law. The rule of law was not observed. The Declaration of Rights, in a series of constitutional amendments, enactments, was not just seeable. Fundamental human rights were violated with impunity. And at independence, no one was held to account for what happened prior to independence. And then in the 1980s, Zimbabwe went through another further political conflict because Robert Mugabe's government, the minority ethnic developed people from the southwest of the country wanted, some of them were not happy with the political settlement, the Lancaster House settlement, in terms of which, or whereby Mugabe became the prime minister after a successful election, and Joshua Nkomo did not become a prime minister. So quite a lot of people were killed. Some argue that about 20,000 people were killed in the southwest part of the country. Some argue that it was genocide, but some say no, it wasn't genocide. And then we come to about 1999, the Movement for Democratic Change, and another opposition party was formed. And in 2008, there was a contested election, hotly contested election. And during the presidential runoff, arguably about 1,000 people, died. We might, some call it politicide. It's not genocide. We might not call it mass atrocities. But for me, any and every human life that has been lost ought to be accounted for. We don't have to wait for mass killings in order for the international community or the internal stakeholders to respond or to say, oh, this is genocide, we need to do something. Each and every human life that is lost is really worth for us to put all our efforts in addressing the situation. So the political strife in 2008 led to mass displacement of people within the country and outside the country. I also happened to be a victim of the strife prior to 2008 because I ended up becoming a European citizen. So the strife prompted SADC, or the Southern African Development Cooperation, the intergovernmental body, to intervene, and then all the political actors came together, and then there was a government of national unity that we have in Zimbabwe. And all the people who perpetrated the past violations were never prosecuted. So the culture of impunity has a long and entrenched history in Zimbabwe, but we use such euphemisms as national reconciliation, national unity, and all that. But in other words, we are making light a heavy issue, which is called impunity in international law. Although at the moment in Zimbabwe, cases of political murders, abductions, disappearances, torture, and intimidation have drastically been reduced, but the overall situation is far from perfect. There are ongoing human rights abuses, including selective application of the law. The military or the security sector looms large and occasionally threaten that they will not accept any transfer of power from Mugabe's party, ZANU-PF. equally worrying is the diminishing, possibility that, the past perpetrators of human rights violations will ever be brought to book. Because the country recently passed a Human Rights Commission bill, which gave rise to the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission. So the commission has limited temporal jurisdiction, which means that it cannot investigate, the crimes that were perpetrated before 2009. And for some of you international relations students, you might know about the Paris principles that should underpin or undergird the constitution or the issues of jurisdiction relating to national human rights institutions. So our human rights institution is far from perfect, and it has got limited temporal jurisdiction, and it is not going to redress past human rights violations. And to that extent, we actually feel that victims of past human rights perpetration should actually have redress, and to that end, we should have a Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission. But the government has been fighting those attempts to set up, but I understand from my reading of the new constitution that we're going to be having such a commission, which is very, very important, because I think if we are to move forward as a nation, we need to redress their past human rights violations. So having given you the background on Zimbabwe, let me go ahead and just talk about maybe the current efforts or measures that civil society is playing in order for us to prevent mass atrocities in future. Just like my fellow brother who spoke before me, it might be very, very presumptuous for us to say as civil society we can stop mass atrocities in future. But all the same, if someone were to ask me, what difference is the work that you're doing making to Zimbabwe? I would argue that I think it is making a strong impact, because if we had not been doing what we are doing, documenting, disseminating, and holding the government to account, I would think, and I would argue that I think human rights violations in Zimbabwe would be worse. I think maybe more people could have died in 2008 and post-2008. So I actually think that civil society, the likes of Mr. Chihora and other civil society actors on the ground are doing a tremendous job in ensuring that Zimbabwe will not repeat the mass atrocities that have dogged the country in the past. So at the moment, we know that the right to justice for sufferers of gross human violations has been universally recognized since World War II. In Zimbabwe, prior and after 1980, civil society activists striving for a more tolerant country have known that it is essential to form collective alliances in order to advocate for the views of both direct and indirect targets of violent abuses. So we see civil society organizations coming together, forming coalitions both within the country and in the region, and forming alliances internationally to make sure that the Zimbabwean situation is under the radar of the international community. So that has actually helped tremendously in ensuring that the culture of impunity is challenged both within and outside Zimbabwe at every turn. So the Zimbabwe Human Rights Forum, the organization that I work for, has 19 member organizations and has got more than 20 partners working within the country through judicial, quasi-judicial, and regional bodies, international bodies, in order to confront and to fight the culture of impunity. And how do we do that? We do that through transitional justice and peace-building campaigns or efforts. So we've got a transitional justice department. We have got public interest civil litigation. We have got public interest criminal litigation. We research and document human rights violations. So the government, although some within the government might say, oh, these people will never really be held to account. I'm telling you that some of them are quaking in their pants. They are really afraid that why are these people documenting what we are doing? because they never know what the information is going to be used for, which is why the government lately has been responding to that by cracking down on civil society, particularly the organizations that document human rights violations, because they know that the evidence has got probative value and might be used one day, whether within the domestic criminal courts or before regional bodies or before international tribunals. So we document, we disseminate, we work laterally, and we work with regional and global institutions to fight impunity. But what measures should the government of Zimbabwe adopt? I think the first and foremost is the restoration of the rule of law. Because currently we actually had a new constitution which came into force last week. But that new constitution has got new and sunset clauses, very, very improved clauses. It has got a broader human rights bill, declaration of rights, which is justiciable. And if that constitution is properly implemented and followed, I think our country can actually achieve the objective of fighting impunity. But the government needs to address the issue of selective with the application of the law. It needs to strengthen national structures that protect human rights, in particular the right to life, and reduce the involvement of the security sector in policing in order to reduce the use of force in the country. Each and every loss of life, particularly during the 2008 presidential elections, should be investigated with rigor, and each and every perpetrator should be apprehended and tried. Pursuing this objective will serve not only to decrease impunity, but also to restore the value that society attaches on life. State authorities must discharge both their constitutional and legislative obligations. The need to achieve justice for all as soon as possible should be the guiding star of all policy and policy reforms, as it is based on the sanctity of life, upon which all the other rights are contingent. In advancing these initiatives, there is much Zimbabwe could learn from countries like Guatemala, for example, which recently convicted a former head of state within their own national courts. Although that decision was later on reversed by the Constitutional Court. We could also learn from Kenya, which recently had a successful truth and reconciliation process. But we also need security sector reform. The security sector needs to be reined on so that it doesn't influence civilian affairs. Zimbabwe needs to ratify the Rome Statute, but I'm not an advocate for the International Criminal Court, for several reasons. And my friend who spoke prior to me has addressed some of the concerns, particularly where we have got superpowers that are refusing to ratify the statute. I do not really think it is fair for us, to push starting up countries, to ratify the statute. But all the same, I actually think in the long run, ratification should be the goal of each and every nation that purports, to be a democratic nation. Zimbabwe needs to cooperate with the international and regional mechanisms. For example, Navi Pillay, the United Nations High Commissioner, recently visited Zimbabwe last year in May. Special rapporteurs on arbitrary detention, on extrajudicial killing. You name them, all of them have been requesting for visits to the country, and some of them have been denied entry. But much more, Zimbabwe needs to adopt educational measures because educational measures can be a form of reparation under international law to avoid, in order for us to stop repetition of past atrocities. I'm not going to get into much detail about educational measures, but much more we need to create a culture of tolerance and inclusion. In creating a culture of tolerance and inclusion, I actually think the country needs to start on a higher ground, on a road to discovery. It is imperative to adopt inclusive approaches that take into account the fact that civil societies are part of the political game. Empirical research evidence emphasizes the importance of local communities in the reconstruction of governance in post-conflict societies. I know my time is limited, so I'm going to rush. So local clans, local tribes are also very important as part of the peace-building process. The war veterans who are often ostracized, that maybe they were perpetrators, I actually think they should be incorporated as part of the post-conflict, reconstruction of our country. In conflict-ridden regions, local polities composed of or led by tribal leaders, clan elders, local business people, local intellectuals, even Muslim clergy have played a pivotal role in reconstruction efforts. Here, an example is Somalia, where they are transforming clan-based militia into national defense forces. According to Mekus, an academic, the reconstruction of this sort will benefit from a high degree of legitimacy and local ownership. In Zimbabwe, for example, ex-combatants, despite maybe their role in the past crisis, I think have part in the grand narrative because they carry what is called traditional cultural repertoire, which can ease the reintegration of displaced people. In countries like Cambodia, for example, the Mayan rituals of the Cambodian healers and mediums have played an important role in recreating symbolic links among members of the community and in interpreting various violent ruptures suffered by the society. So even though some external international organizations would argue that local communities do not replace the central government needed to create a peaceful and secure post-conflict state, I would argue that I think we need an organic and approach which is much more sustainable. Let me just conclude by suggesting, I think, what you could do in order for what this forum could do to promote towards this particular topic. Number one, superpowers should ratify the Rome Statute before they dictate on the smaller powers to do so. Number two, we need the strengthening of the concept of universal jurisdiction. For example, the South African Supreme Court recently held that they can prosecute criminal offenders from Zimbabwe. So universal jurisdiction has to be strengthened. And number three, we need to look at the post-2015 global development agenda, which focuses on protection of the rule of law, good governance, in holding governments to account, which David Cameron called the golden thread of development. And there's need for more diplomatic engagement with the government of Zimbabwe. Track 1, Track 2, and Track 3 engagement all are needed and necessary in order to end the political strife which might give rise to mass atrocities in Zimbabwe. Thank you.